Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the DS Show. I'm joined by someone very special in the Anaplan ecosystem. We've known each other for quite some time now. I'm joined by my good friend, Jesse Walklin. He is the CRO over at Codex Recruitment. Welcome to the show, Jesse.
Thanks. Yeah. Special guy in the Anaplan space. No one's quite said it like that before, but I think that could catch on. Maybe that can be my new title on LinkedIn.
By all means, go ahead and own it. Yeah, well, appreciate you making the time and joining us today. It's always great to speak with people in the Anaplan space, and I think for me, this is actually the first time I'm having someone who is dedicated to the recruitment space in Anaplan, and we're very curious to hear all about your different insights. But before we jump into that, to introduce yourself to the audience, let the audience know who you are, what you do, maybe a little bit of your background, and what is it that Codex Recruitment does and specializes in.
Of course, yeah. Starting with me personally, I did history at university, which lends itself not to much. So rather than be a historian or a teacher, I decided to maybe get in sales or recruitment and kind of came about. So this is my 10th year in recruitment now. Always been in the EPM space. I started off with SAP technology and then IBM, but for the last probably 7.5, 8 years has been Anaplan focused. The first 2 years of which were in EMEA in Europe, and then the last 5 or 6 have been focused solely on North America. So I've probably helped 350 people or so in that time find new positions. Probably the vast majority being in the Anaplan space. Codex Recruitment as a business is focused solely in the EPM recruitment space. So all my colleagues have a similar focus to mine, but they might work with a competitor tool, So while I do Anaplan, another team member does OneStream, someone else does Oracle Hyperion, someone does Vendor Solutions, Profix, etc. So we've got the kind of full wheelhouse of EPM covered. And I always say it's a bit like trainers when I'm explaining it to a new to recruitment. There's Nike trainers, there's Adidas trainers. They all do similar things, but they might look slightly different and they might be more suited to, a different company, or in that instance, maybe a different runner or athlete or whatever. So yeah, that's been 10 years of my life. I've probably said Anaplan 50 times a day for the last 8 years or so, or 7 years. So yeah, it's been a good journey, and now it looks really strategic that I chose Anaplan because of the growth that it's had, but I kind of was in the right place at the right time and kind of followed my nose on that, I guess.
Yeah, interesting you mentioned that because, a lot of people always have this kind of interesting story of how they first stumbled upon Anaplan. So what was that moment when you first got introduced to Anaplan? Like, how did you get involved, kind of by fate, or, it's kind of luck, or how did kind of Codex get involved with Anaplan?
So I was focusing on IBM TM1 at the time. So a good client of mine and good client of ours still is Bedford Consulting in the UK. So they were one of the first ones to mention Anaplan to me, and that they just partnered with it. I think especially in Europe, they were certainly the first to really, put their color to the mast, as it were, to Anaplan. So they were kind of looking for people with cross-trainable skills. So maybe it's strong Excel modelers or people from a different EPM technology to learn Anaplan, because there just simply wasn't the amount of people in the space already. So I remember those early days was very much explaining Anaplan to everyone who hadn't heard it. Now, when you mention Anaplan to even finance professionals who maybe haven't seen the system, they've often heard of it, whether it be in competition or whatever. So it's been interesting to see that rise from obscurity to certain familiarity in that time, for sure.
Yeah, can you talk about maybe like the evolution of the relationship you have had with Anaplan, and maybe just the public attention that it's gotten? Like, how have you seen from like a candidate standpoint the shift from when you first started to where it is now?
I think, to be fair, it's everyone that I would explain to Anaplan and then maybe sent them some of the YouTube videos back then, they all see the power of it. And I think especially people that had just been using Excel, maybe they were financial analysts or FP&A managers who had just been using Excel, I think they certainly saw from the power of it. So it wasn't like I was having to do some kind of hard sell to convince them on the technology. I think the intuitive nature of it and its flexibility has always attracted that. I just think more and more now people have seen it. So my job's even easier. It's changed now because, Anaplan is still a niche talent for sure, but it's a talent that people, I think, can expect with a bit of a search and a specialist like myself to be able to find someone who does have model building skills or solution architect skills. Like, there is an expectation that it's different in some states where there's a smaller pool, but it's certainly changed from a talent where you need a skill where you need to train to being able to hire for it. It's interesting with new technologies. If you think about like pigment or whatever, they're kind of in that first stage where there are some pigment modelers and there's more every month, but realistically, they're needing to whip up that kind of talent from, I guess, finance people or other EPM technologies. So it's been interesting to see it develop and that kind of supply and demand, match out a bit, but it's still certainly a very in-demand skill, Anaplan, for sure.
something at least on my two, where, we've noticed certainly, like, for example, back in pre-COVID / during COVID days, the supply and demand was very different compared to where it is now, right? At least my observation, I'm curious if you agree with this, but my observation was back then there was way more demand for talent than there was supply. And today I would say that has kind of, I wouldn't say flipped, but at least it's starting to even out a bit. I'm curious, is that kind of what you're seeing on?
I think the candidates knew how powerful they were when you mentioned, probably 2021 and maybe 2022 being real peak years for that, where there was a big boom in hiring in general. We as a business, as a 3-brand business, 3PX, we felt big demand across the board because a lot of people had kind of paused their hiring during that, but the hiring plans were still there. So yeah, that certainly resulted in a real boom. And like you say, demand being really high and supply not being so. It did see the introduction of really high salaries, which then I think caused some redundancies in 2023 and even last year, where those salaries maybe weren't sustainable. They were helpful in 2022 and 23 where the need was so great. I think when things flattened out a little bit and things returned to a little bit more normal, those high salaries were maybe seen as too much of a cost to certain businesses. I can think of in the tech space in particular. So there's definitely a meeting there in the middle. Candidates, naturally will take a little bit of time to adjust to the new market conditions and their new expectations in those. And I think it's still a very, very, healthy market with really great earning potential for people right at the top of that game and the people progressing through, and that's the sell that I often have. Maybe, I speak to a senior finance manager who's worked with Anaplan from an internal perspective. Maybe they've built models and they're kind of thinking, hey, do I stay on this trajectory? It's a safe trajectory in finance. It's a solid one. In 3 years, I'll be senior manager. And if I push it, I can get to director, etc. But really on the system side of things is where I've seen unbelievable progression for people and real opportunities to advance their careers really, really quickly. In the consulting landscape for fast growing partners, there's great opportunities for people to really jump up a few steps. And then if they do want to go back in-house, they could potentially do that as a director of FP&A or a director of finance systems, even if the gap has only been 2.5, 3 years, because they've gained such rare skills that combines with their finance background for sure.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, I've got several colleagues or former colleagues and friends who have ended up making a maneuver like that, where they end up, maybe, and I've seen it go in all directions too. Like sometimes they start off in consulting and then they end up being a director, or they go the other direction actually, where they start off as a director and they ended up starting their own consultancy, right? And even internally, like people at Anaplan internally that work there, I've seen kind of the movement from internal to going to a partner to going to in-house, right? So I'm curious, what is there kind of one that you find to be more common than another?
I think whenever we engage with a customer, an in-house role, I think whenever they're hiring for a finance systems person, whatever level, I think those people that have got consulting experience and have done multiple implementations, in this instance of Anaplan, they seem to be our most placeable candidate, or the client, or the candidate that gets the client's interest so much. As long as they've got that finance background and they're comfortable with more BAU kind of finance tasks, and they have that grounding in what a P&L is and balance sheet and things like that, I think they're the people that really get interest. I think when you're talking more of a finance role and Anaplan is a bit more of a user, maybe it isn't as exposed, but for those really true roles where they do want some technical skills, yes, they would consider a model builder from another business, absolutely. But I think those people jump straight to the top of the list if they do have that kind of in-depth. And it's more the use case, the variety of use case experience, the variety of implementations, the amount of issues and problems they might have run into and difficult clients and that kind of thing really gives them a breadth of experience that maybe you wouldn't get. That's a blanket statement that doesn't apply to everyone, but generally is what we see is that movement from in-house after getting a bit of Anaplan exposure just by chance. Their company decided to implement it, and then leveraging that in a systems-based role where someone has really realized that project-based stuff really lights their fire a bit more than maybe the BAU finance stuff. But I'm, I guess, biased in my response because a lot of the roles I do work on are that slightly more technical. So I do see a lot more of those people that want to do that pivot. For sure, that kind of straight finance route is an absolutely brilliant one as well, but it's probably less of the people that I work with as much.
Yeah, it's very, very fascinating just seeing how the movement in the industry is kind of changing and evolving over time. And it's going to be very curious to see how it evolves even further now, especially with the whole Anaplan's going into the app strategy. And we were just chatting a bit off camera, but it's I feel like it's a new era coming in with Anaplan, and I'll be curious to see how the talent gets.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Another topic on that is kind of, remote working from home, hybrid, that kind of thing, where consultants, 6 years ago actually had maybe the worst work-life balance. They were traveling Monday to Thursday, away from home a lot of time, and it wasn't something that was that sustainable. We're actually seeing now, if people want flexibility, consulting is the best space to get that. The portion of those roles that are remote are still like 80, 90%. There'll obviously be some travel and things like that around that. But now, especially with the movement back to office, a lot of those customer-based roles, which maybe seem like a better work-life balance option, are actually the ones where you're commuting in and needing to be in office. So it's interesting how that's flipped, that maybe the negative that most people spoke to about consulting, i.e. the travel, is kind of out of it a little bit. I think the only thing that people comment on the consulting lifestyle is the kind of the speed of project and how they're kind of in and out without maybe seeing the long-term, impact of their work. That's the major reason I get now. If someone wants to make the switch, it's mainly because they want to join a business, get to know that business intricately well, and really learn that business inside out and really see the long-term impact of their Anaplan work. That's the major reason I see these days of wanting to make a switch. 6 years ago, it would have been about the travel and lifestyle changes personally that would have caused that probably.
Yeah, it's like a really fascinating too, because I hadn't thought about it in that way. But it's, now that you mention it, I know of friends and folks who have been interviewing with, different in-house roles. And yeah, I think that is something with definitely, like, it feels like some of the tech giants, some of the, the folks using Anaplan as customers, like, I have seen that kind of return back to office. And then you're right, like maybe consulting is a place where, work from home is a little bit more seen as a little bit more in a favorable light as compared to what it used to be. And I'm curious then, like you mentioned, kind of the dynamic between consultancies versus like working in-house. What are some of the benefits aside from the remote work aspect that really draw candidates to consulting?
I think while I almost use it as a negative right now, I do think the fast-paced nature of it and the variety is really interesting for people. I think for the right person, that's, a new dynamic challenge all the time. And there's no kind of, like, some projects might be similar, but they're all slightly different. The use case might be slightly different. So it doesn't feel like you're doing the same thing over and over. And there's no kind of cyclical element of it, which there might be in alternative positions. So I think that certainly seems to be, certainly for those people early to mid in their career, it seems like something they really want to jump at to do. And I think you get the best training, you get the best support. You're normally joining a business that you might have master Anaplan as solution architects to learn from. Sometimes in-house you can be the fulcrum of all knowledge, so you know what you know, but you don't know. Some customers obviously have a big Anaplan COE where that isn't the case, and there's really good opportunities to collaborate. But I think certainly that opportunity to learn from others is prominent in people's favoring for consulting. And like I say, the progression I think is fantastic in consulting opportunities. There's less kind of gradings or rules around it, I guess. If you're charged out at your client at a certain rate and you're delivering great work, then that can easily be reflected in your position and your salary. If you're more senior and you're bringing in business and using your network to boost accounts and boost clients, again, that can be reflected in your salary. So I think feels like there's a little bit more control over your career and when you make those jumps.
That's quite interesting. Now, from a Codex standpoint, like, what is the nature of your relationship with the ecosystem? Are you guys more so like, or I guess maybe the way to phrase it is like, what's the balance between your relationship with Anaplan, relationship with vendors or partners, relationship with in-house? Where do you guys kind of fit into the space?
Yeah, so we're an introductory agency throughout all of that. We do want to offer consultative support. Like, I'm more than happy to jump on a call similar to this, with any kind of customers or partners who are interested in the hiring landscape. Maybe they've just implemented Anaplan in Ohio and they're like, what are the options? We're currently leveraging a third-party consulting company, which has been great, but we are keen to bring those skills in-house. What does it cost to bring in a model builder? What does it cost to bring in a solution architect? Hybrid schedule here. We would love for this Anaplanner to follow that and be part of the business, but is that realistic where we are? Like, what are the options? So we definitely offer that consultative support. Or, as a business, we probably speak to 150, 200 EPM professionals every single week. So we are able to really cross those boundaries, and we've done all that work already. So yeah, we're an introductory agency. We specialize in helping people join partners and customers. In the main, 70% of our work is probably with partners and consulting companies, just because of the regularity and the opportunity for repeat business. Most end users, it might be that we help them hire one person, and maybe every 12, 18 months, if they're growing that team, we would potentially go again, but it wouldn't be as regular. So even though our portion of clients, if you will, there's way more than 50% of them are end users, but due to the amount of business we do with each, more of our business is weighted towards the consulting companies. We do support Anaplan. We're on Anaplan's website as their provider of talent to their partners and customers. So we've only recently in the last year started offering them some support when needed. But yeah, the majority of our work across the board is with partners. We have a really good customer base in each technology, and then we've done spot business with the vendors as and when required.
Yeah, it seems like you've really found a great place for yourself in the ecosystem, and it's a great place to be. I'm curious, like from now, just kind of pivoting a little bit to more of the HR side of things. Like, do you have any? Well, if you can share, do you have any like fun HR stories? I'm sure, like without disclosing anything, with names or anything. But is there any particular story that resonated with you with the candidate or someone that you guys helped place?
In terms of like funny, like in terms of what they've done or interactions with HR or
anything, right? Like maybe we could start with like what's maybe a story you're most proud of? How about that?
Yeah. I guess a funny story is that in our business you can do kind of retained work and contingent work. So retained work is where you're paid up front in a portion of the deal size to kind of get a mutual commitment, and that really is something that we do with a lot of clients because we're kind of in the space, we've got a lot of knowledge to give, and we really want to prioritize each role. So having that commitment up front helps us do that. It then means that they get extra special treatment, they get multiple members of the team assisting them. But I did work with a giant kind of retailer, one of a top 5 most well-known brands probably. I spoke with them and I didn't quite have the guts to pitch a retainer to them because I really wanted the business. So I pitched contingent, and then they kind of said we do retained. This was a client in Europe at the time, and they do retained, and I was like, okay, cool, we do retained as well. And then I got off the phone and everyone asked me, how did I do that? How did I win such business? And I was kind of like, you can't really teach that kind of thing. So realistically, it was very much that it was pitched to me rather than the other way around. I was humbled enough to admit to everyone that actually I hadn't done anything good on that front. But there's lots of things like that. And I think it's a brilliant, if anyone happens to stumble across this more thinking about recruitment as an industry or whatever, I think it's a pretty good one. Like I said, I left university after doing history without, a clear route of what I wanted to do. But, if you have that kind of grit and kind of ambition and you want to be speaking to people and you've got that kind of enthusiasm, there's a lot of excitement on the way. I'm sure it's the same with the company you set up now, that excitement that when you win business and that excitement when you have that success, it's cool, right? And then that's what I love to do, and I can be so enthusiastic with it with people that join the business. I used to ask my grandma the stuff that she didn't want, and it was like crockery and stuff, and I'd go out the front of our house when I was like 6 or 7, put up little labels of the price of the crockery and sit behind this table all day. And if someone came up to the table, I'd be like ready to pitch to them, ready to sell anything. And if I did sell something, it was an amazing buzz. And there is something similar in this space where you do help someone find a job that they're really enthusiastic about, and it's a great step for them. There's a real great sense of completion. So there's a lot of dynamic people in the office here, and there's a lot of laughs that we try and share. There's obviously tough moments, like I say, in the building of your business as well. I'm sure when you miss out on pitches and stuff like that, there's tough moments, but hopefully, like we have, you do that with people that you really have that camaraderie with, and everyone can kind of laugh and cry as you do that. Because like I say, I was the second hire here. So there was an office of 3 or 4 of us back 10 years ago. We now have 35, 36 across London and across New York. So it's exciting to see that. So a lot of laughs on the way for sure.
Yeah, a lot to unpack. Certainly resonated a lot with the whole success, and then also with some of those crying moments too, right? But I think you might agree with this too, is like a lot of that, the direction you end up pivoting to or the direction you end up going, like a lot of it depends on the team you've surrounded yourself with, right? And it's when you have I always love the term, like when you have a dream team surrounding you, like even in the moments where you hit roadblocks and what appear to be failures, like those moments can be galvanizing. And if you got a right team around you, they'll pick you up and lift you up, and those can really turn out to be some of the best learning moments. At least for me, those have, right? And I'm not afraid to admit some of the failures or roadblocks I've hit. But
that's what I say about anyone. Like, why, if anyone asks me, how have you been successful or how have you had your success? It's kind of like I was willing to make those mistakes and throw myself into something, and I think culture is a key thing for us here. And I think it's a key thing when people are talking about building out an Anaplan partner or an Anaplan COE, there's a lot of options for these candidates, and if you don't have a culture that resonates with people, there will be someone that will pay $15,000 more to get them in, so it's really key to have that kind of culture, that sense of ownership. And if we go back to remote, how do you drive that culture remotely? Like, how do you make sure that you have that kind of loyalty that is mutual? You don't want anyone to be loyal to a bad business or a bad team, so that's what I've really invested in here, is just that feeling of community. There's a lot of recruitment companies there's a lot of alternative places for our team to go and work if you don't give them that sense of real value, and I think that's a key thing in the Anaplan space. It's a tricky thing to retain talent. Money is one thing, but that sense that they're belonging to something more than just building a couple of Anaplan models and seeing the kind of impact, I think, has been key to the businesses that I've seen have success and scalable growth in this time. They've really got that kind of family feel, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're a small business. It just means that they have little units within each that really bond people together, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's also just been my personal experience too, is like the gigs or even I see this with clients and even like within our team too. Like I find that people who end up, sticking together or sticking around, really that culture piece is what drives that. And, I think it's a crazy concept, right? If people enjoy coming to work and like the people they're surrounded with, they might end up sticking around, right? As opposed to an environment which may not be that, right? People kind of sort of drives them away, the people they're with, right? So.
And I think that's where I've seen companies struggle a little bit, is like the big engines, the big names that have Anaplan, that you do need a bit of fluidity, you do need a bit of flexibility when you're hiring and retaining in this space, whereas a lot of those companies have really fixed salary bandings, they have really fixed work from home or return to work or those kind of things, which then have a real blanket impact. And a lot of those big businesses can then recruit and replace those people in more kind of less niche areas. I think when that kind of approach is then applied to a niche area like Anaplan or any niche skill, I think it can cause some problems for those leaders, those COE leaders, to really build out that team and compete with companies that can be more flexible and nimble. So it's certainly a balancing act between being a big engine and a great one that's obviously made those companies who they are, to actually in the little business units making sure they can secure the talent that can make sure that the millions of pounds spent on Anaplan has been worth it and that they're maximizing it, basically.
Is that something you've been noticing, like in general, like from like a recruiting standpoint, just the balance between compensation versus that work-life balance? Like, is that a big part of the conversations you're having with candidates and clients?
I think so, because everyone did get used to remote working, and 90%, like 5 years ago, 90% of the roles were remote, or 4 years ago, 90% of the new roles were remote. And I try and think back to before COVID, like every interview process I ever had, someone had to go on site and meet that team. You would never hire anyone remotely. I remember sending directions of London tubes on how people to get to the office like every time. So it's so interesting how quickly things change, and then that old normal seems so removed and almost no one remembers it. So it's definitely a readjustment, and one that I think candidates necessarily aren't 100% prepared to make just yet. There are more companies that are returning to hybrid and more Anaplanners that want to do that. If I speak to someone who's in a remote role and wanting to find an in-office one, it's a rarity, compared to the other way. So I think there's a give and take on that for sure. I think if you're remote, you may need to be a bit more flexible on salary, especially if you're in a high cost of living metro. To want a remote role when they might be able to hire someone that's in a lower cost of living area, it's hard to then compete. So I think it's certainly a bit of give or take, and it will certainly fall out. And I think it is already falling out into an equilibrium where everyone's relatively satisfied, but clients now are probably returning to office a bit more than candidates are willing to. So there's a bit of a mismatch. Still able to find the people that are content, but it's certainly, if someone is solely looking for remote roles now, it certainly does limit your options more than it would have done 4 years ago, for example.
Have you noticed anything in particular with like travel, for example? Like, where does kind of traveling role sort of fit into that work from home versus hybrid? Like, where does travel fit in?
Yeah, so I think, like I say, the consulting partners that we had 5-6 years ago, 75-80% travel would have been normal, and that's kind of what people would have been expecting. Now, if it's more than 25%, it probably is a bit of a trickier sell to people. I think generally these consulting roles are generally billed as, hey, it's remote, but if you need to travel, you need to travel. I think it's going to be largely remote. You're going to have good kind of balance there. But if a client needs you on site for a week, we're going to need to do that. So I think that's the attitude people are going into consulting with now. There might be periods of your year that are a little bit more travel heavy. There might be 4 months where you don't travel at all and you're fully remote. So I think that's probably the way it's fallen through, which I think most people quite like. I think what people didn't like was every Sunday catching a flight or every Monday morning catching a flight and not getting back till late Thursday or whatever, and then working from home Friday. I think grinds people down after a while. I think there's a bit more ad hoc travel where you don't get in a routine. And don't get me wrong, there are still some. I spoke to a chap who was at one of the large consulting companies and he's still traveling quite a lot, but that's certainly an anomaly now for sure.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting how times have changed and how just the nature of recruitment and HR are evolving. From your standpoint, like just over the years, what's been your biggest lesson learned when it comes to just being in HR? Like, is there a moment or a lesson that really sticks out to you?
I think probably the lesson that I try and teach everyone here is just have your specialism, be an expert. I think especially, I don't know if it's a different generation, but everything's kind of immediate now, isn't it? You order food and it's there in 10 minutes, like everything, and you go on Instagram and someone's made $1 million in a month by trading currency or whatever it might be, or Bitcoin or whatever. And that it kind of gives that immediacy. And I think there's still a real patience required in kind of what we do and in kind of the recruitment world to really be an expert and to be really urgent and have a good day, but to also be patient, to know in a year's time you're still going to be speaking with these people and you need to build a good relationship, or that company's not hiring now, or that candidate's not looking out now, just to stay in that kind of realm. And I think that's good for all relationship building. You have no idea, who's going to invite you on a podcast, for example. You have no idea like what relationships are going to be really, really fruitful. And I think you just have to give every relationship all the value it's worthy in that moment. So I think that's the big lesson that I try and teach people: have that expertise, be that specialist. Don't try and run after the newest, shiniest thing. Make a name for yourself, have a reputation, and go from there. And hopefully your life becomes a little bit easier with things coming a little bit more to you if you've done that stuff correctly. The same in the consulting world. If you deliver great project, go above and beyond, and then in 2 years' time that client is looking to hire a head of Anaplan, and you've had a really, really strong impression on that project and you've made really good relationships throughout, who's going to be at the front of the queue to get that job. So I think that's probably things that I've seen, especially Anaplan being a small world. I want to make a good impression whenever I speak to anyone, and I think all the candidates should want to do that as well, and best ones will really go above and beyond just for the sake of doing a good job, really. But yeah, I think that's it, being a specialist and an expert and really getting a footprint somewhere.
Yeah, and I agree with that, what you mentioned about how it's a very small space. I mean, I know the space is growing and evolving. There's always new people coming in, but the degrees of separation from like you and me, for example, I mean, you're all the way across the pond, but I'm sure there's like 1 or 2 people separating us from like, we probably have like tons of mutual connections in common. And like even if you're working at a customer, you're probably 1 or 2 people away from knowing like someone at Anaplan or, at a consultancy. And like, even if people like, there's so many people that move around, right? And, you just end up seeing like, oh, I remember that face. They used to work at such and such, and now look at that. They're at in-house, or now they're at Anaplan.
And whenever anyone speaks about their colleague or whatever, it will always be someone that I know or I've been in touch with, and I'm getting more and more. Got a networking event after Anaplan Connect in New York, which maybe you can put the invite to. But yeah, it's just great to meet and connect in that space. I know everyone's LinkedIn photo quite intricately well, so it's always nice to actually meet them in person after seeing them online for so long. So yeah, it's great. I really enjoy that kind of feeling of community. And yeah, you're right, the space is getting larger. Every client, every project has had a consulting company on there. So even if you've been involved in Anaplan for a year, you've probably, without even going to any of the connections, made 10 connections in the space through maybe 3 companies did demonstrations to you. They demoed how they would be the best fit, and it quickly kind of, I guess the web of network quickly goes out. And especially if you're going to the events, then there's always great like fresh faces, but also ones that you've met in the past. And it always surprises me how many people do know one another and how many people I know when I go to that event. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, likewise. And I plan to be there myself and look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah.
Is there just anything you would like to leave the audience with? It's been a great conversation. We've kind of touched on a lot of key areas, but is there any kind of last message you'd wish to leave the audience with in terms of like HR recruitment in the space, or anything else you feel?
I think that was a good conversation. I think we flowed through some things. I don't think there's anything in particular that I would say without plugging myself too much. It would be great to chat to any Anaplan customers who found any of this useful, and it certainly doesn't have to be an active business case straight away. I just love talking to people and connecting, and I always surprise myself when I do something like this of maybe how much knowledge I have isn't common knowledge, because it is my everyday, so it almost feels quite familiar and feels quite obvious. But I think I would have spoken to 1,500 Anaplanners in that time, and I would have had a real grasp on the feeling of the market. So yeah, I guess last note is I've really enjoyed my time in Anaplan. I'm so grateful for the opportunities that it's given me, and like I say, it wasn't a strategic move, and I kind of followed my nose, and the demand grew and grew, and it's a great space to be. We as a company enjoy being in that finance systems niche massively, where finance people are here and IT people are here, and we really help those people in the middle that can speak to both. So yeah, it's a great time to be in it. I'm celebrating my 10th year this year, so I'm looking forward to more connections, and very grateful for the invite on here and being able to chat through that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, congratulations on all your success, and I'm sure the audience will find some value out of this. Thanks for coming on the show, and look forward to seeing you in New York.
My pleasure. See you then. Thanks, Daanish. Cheers.
All right. Cheers. All right. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of the DS Show. We'll see you guys on the next episode.